On the evening of May 26, 1941, a single torpedo burst harmlessly against Bismarck's armor belt, and the Royal Navy lost its last chance to stop her. 8 days earlier, the battleship and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen had slipped out of Gotenhafen under Admiral Günther Lütjens, bound for the Atlantic convoy lanes in Operation Rheinübung. What followed was meant to be a commerce raid. It became instead a contest over whether one ship could bend the strategy of an empire. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The raid drew blood almost at once. On May 24th, in the grey water of the Denmark Strait, Bismarck's fifth salvo found HMS Hood, the most famous warship in the world. She blew apart in minutes. Of 1,418 men aboard, 3 survived. HMS Prince of Wales, new and still working out her faults, fought on alone and was driven off, but not before she put 3 shells into Bismarck. One of them ruptured a fuel tank. Lütjens, bleeding oil and trailing a slick his pursuers could follow, abandoned the raid and turned for Brest. Prinz Eugen was detached to continue independently. That same night, Swordfish biplanes from HMS Victorious pressed home a torpedo attack and scored 1 hit squarely on the armor belt, with negligible effect. It seemed a footnote at the time. It was a warning no one read. And what that armor belt could shrug off, 2 nights later would decide far more than one ship's survival. By the morning of May 26, Bismarck was 700 miles from Brest and pulling away. Lütjens had shaken his shadow as the day before, then squandered the advantage with a long radio transmission that British direction finders fixed within hours. A coastal command, Catalina, relocated her at dawn. But Admiral Tovey's home fleet battleships were falling behind, their bunkers running dry. Only one force could still reach her, the carrier Ark Royal, steaming north with Somerville's Force H from Gibraltar. That evening, in a full gale, 15 Swordfish went in through cloud and flak. 1 torpedo found the target. In the history we know, it struck her stern and jammed her rudders 15 degrees to port, condemning her to circle helplessly until Tovey's guns arrived. In this timeline, the same torpedo runs true against her side and detonates against the main belt, exactly as the Victorious hit had. A column of water, a shudder through the hull, and nothing more. The air crews reported hits. The plotting tables told the truth. Bismarck's speed had not fallen. Through the night, the destroyers snapped at her and were driven off. Tovey turned for home with his tanks nearly empty. On May 29th, under a thickening umbrella of Luftwaffe fighters, Bismarck passed the breakwater at Brest, down by the bow, streaked with oil and alive. Brest already held 2 capital ships. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had been there since March 22, after sinking 22 ships in Operation Berlin, and the RAF had been trying to destroy them ever since. Flying Officer Kenneth Campbell had died putting a torpedo into Gneisenau in April and won a posthumous Victoria Cross for it. Now Bismarck joined them, and on June 1st, Prinz Eugen. 4 heavy ships in one harbor, a day's steaming from the Atlantic convoy routes. Grand Admiral Raeder understood what he had and argued it to Hitler plainly. The squadron did not need to sail to hurt Britain. It needed only to exist. He was right. Every convoy across the Atlantic now had to be planned as if 4 German capital ships might appear on the horizon, which meant every important convoy needed a battleship of its own. Bomber Command was ordered to solve the problem from the air, and hundreds of sorties that had been aimed at the Ruhr were diverted to the docks of Brittany, flown at heavy cost, against some of the most concentrated flak in Europe, with results measured in near misses. Churchill, for whom the escape of Hood's killer had become a personal wound, demanded the effort be doubled. The bill for that fixation would not be paid in Brittany. It would be paid in the Mediterranean, and it was coming due already. The German airborne invasion of Crete had begun on May 20, and by the end of the month, Admiral Cunningham's Mediterranean fleet was fighting to lift the garrison off the beaches under relentless air attack. In the history we know, the evacuation ran through June 1 and cost 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers. In this timeline, it is not allowed to run that long. With Force H recalled toward the Atlantic to watch Brest, and the Admiralty's attention riveted on the German squadron, London orders Cunningham to cut his losses after 2 nights. The ships that would have made the last runs to Sfakia never sail. The arithmetic is brutal. Thousands of Commonwealth soldiers, Australians, New Zealanders, British, wait on the beaches for ships that do not come and pass into German captivity. Cunningham's fleet is spared some of its losses, but the Mediterranean it must now hold is thinner than ever. Malta's convoys go forward with reduced cover, because Somerville's Force H, the hinge between two seas, keeps being pulled through the Strait of Gibraltar and out into the Atlantic. One squadron in one French harbour is reaching 1,000 miles into a different theatre, and it is only beginning. Britain lived by sea imports, and the squadron at Brest set about starving her without firing a shot. The mechanism was simple and merciless. Convoys could not sail until battleship cover was available. Battleships were few, old, and needed everywhere at once, so convoys waited. Cycles lengthened. Ships that should have been carrying steel and grain swung at anchor in Halifax and the Clyde. Through the autumn of 1941, monthly import figures fell below the levels of the worst U-boat months, and the U-boats had not stopped working either. Rationing tightened. Stockpiles of food and steel, built up against invasion, were drawn down instead against arithmetic. The Ministry of War Transport put the matter to Churchill in the starkest terms. Its officials could manage. The German squadron was winning its campaign from inside a harbour, and every week it remained intact. Britain grew measurably weaker. The Prime Minister's answer was to demand, again, its destruction, more bombers over Brest, more battleships on the Brest watch. But there was one power whose ships were not yet at war, and whose president was watching the North Atlantic with growing intent. Franklin Roosevelt had been edging the United States into the Atlantic War for months, and the concentration at Brest handed him the argument he needed. If the Royal Navy could no longer cover the Western Ocean alone, then the U.S. Navy would move up. American battleships took over cover for the Iceland run. The shoot-on-sight order, which history records in September, comes earlier in this timeline and means more, because American heavy ships are now standing between German raiders and the convoys. The consequences followed the logic. American destroyers and U-boats met in the grey water south of Iceland, and the encounters stopped being incidents and became a pattern. American sailors died in an undeclared war, months before any declaration existed, in waters their government had chosen to contest. Isolationist senators protested. The sinking of neutral pretense continued anyway. By the autumn of 1941, the United States Navy was fighting a naval war in everything but name, hardened and blooded, its crews learning lessons that would otherwise have cost far more to learn later. But the ocean the Americans were entering was only one of the seas Britain could no longer cover. On the far side of the world, another was being quietly abandoned. First Sea Lord Sir Dudley Pound faced a ledger that would not balance. Every modern battleship Britain owned was mortgaged to the Brest Watch Prince of Wales, King George V, each new hull as it commissioned. The fleet that was to deter Japan, the Fleet Admiral Sir Tom Phillips was designated to command, existed as a column of names on paper, and the names kept being crossed out. In the history we know, Prince of Wales sailed for Singapore in the autumn of 1941. In this timeline, she never leaves the Atlantic. The Far East gets promises, and promises do not carry guns. When Japan struck in December, Malaya's defense rested on obsolescent aircraft and unsupported infantry, with no fleet behind them and none coming. There was no Force Z to be sunk on December 10th, and no Force Z to matter at all. The Japanese moved down the peninsula against a defense that knew from the first day that the sea flank was gone. Singapore, the fortress built for a fleet that never arrived, surrendered weeks earlier than the February date history records. Behind it, the Indian Ocean lay open, and every convoy route to India and the Middle East had to be redrawn. The squadron at Brest had reached, at last, around the entire world, and then Hitler demanded that it earn its keep. Through the spring of 1942, the pressure from Berlin grew impossible to deflect. The ships that had done so much by doing nothing were to Hitler ships doing nothing. Raiders' fleet in being argument had run its course. Lütjens, a fatalist who had brought his wounded flagship home once and never expected to be so fortunate again, was ordered to take the fleet to sea against a major troop convoy. Bismarck, her sister Tirpitz now fully worked up, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prince Eugen. The largest German surface force ever assembled steamed into the mid-Atlantic. It met what a year of crisis had built, a combined Anglo-American battle line, British and US battleships in company, covered by carrier aircraft, guided by direction finding and patient shadowing. The battle that followed broke the German surface fleet as a fighting force. But the victory settled accounts that could no longer be reopened. The soldiers taken on Crete's beaches were still in prison camps. Singapore had still fallen early, and the Indian Ocean had still been laid bare. American sailors had still died in an undeclared war, and their navy entered its declared one already a veteran. One torpedo, striking steel instead of steering gear, had not changed who would win the war. It had changed what the war would cost, and who would pay, and when. That is the quiet lesson of the ship that reached Brest. Navies are rarely beaten by the battles that are fought. They are beaten, ton by ton and theater by theater, by the battles they must always be ready for, and the price of readiness is paid somewhere else, by someone else, in a place the planners never see.